I'm a retired sheriff. This incident happened quite a while ago, but it's the only thing in all my years on the job that I could never explain. I was working for a district in rural Illinois. There wasn't much that went on in that county, and we all liked it that way. Occasionally, I'd have to deal with domestic disturbances or property damage, but it wasn't anything like working in a big city. Of course, we'd get calls about teenagers disturbing the peace, usually on the weekends. One of the downsides of being in a rural setting is that there's not much to do. So, kids tend to go around and cause trouble. Normally, it isn't much of an issue, and just me showing up in the squad car is enough to scare them straight. This particular incident happened on a Friday night. There is a section of densely wooded hiking trails open to the public at the edge of town. There's about 14 miles of trails in total. The trails aren't very well maintained and go pretty deep into the woods. There's a creek that flows through the woods. It used to be a proper river years ago, but it's dried up for whatever reason. I'm not a conservation officer, so I couldn't tell you why. Back in the late 1800s, there used to be a mill on the river, and its remnants still stand there today. These days, the old mill has become a hangout for local teenagers to drink and party. Last time I was out there, it was full of empty cans, bottles, and graffiti. The kids think they are far enough into the forest to avoid getting caught, but the problem is that there are several homes that surround this plot of woods, and the people who live there can hear the kids partying. I got a noise complaint from one of the neighbors claiming that they heard kids screaming and saw flashing lights in the forest near the old mill. This definitely wasn't my first time busting teenagers at the mill, so I headed out without a second thought. The hike to reach the mill was about 3 miles. Not exactly how I wanted to spend my Friday night, but I suppose it all pays the same. There weren't any cars parked in the public lot when I arrived, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. Teenagers up to no good are smart. They probably parked elsewhere and walked in. I headed into the woods with my flashlight. I could hear the kids laughing and yelling just about as soon as I set forth on the trail. They didn't sound too far away, certainly not far enough to be at the mill. My first thought was, I was glad I wasn't going to have to hike all the way to the mill tonight. At first it sounded like the voices were coming from somewhere left of my location, but as I tried to follow them, they moved to my right. I called out and told them to stop screwing around, but I didn't get an answer. I knew they most likely saw me and were heading out of there as fast as they could. I decided to head to the mill anyway, since that was where the neighbor claimed the lights were coming from, and quite possibly there would still be something going on there. The forest got quiet for the rest of my walk to the mill. The trail was severely overgrown, but I managed to follow it even in the dark. I heard the creek and knew I was close. And that's when I heard the voices again. Same as last time, it was just screaming and laughing. I couldn't make out any words. I shined my flashlight towards the mill, but I didn't see anyone there. They were somewhere in the forest, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. The voices somehow both sounded far away and very close at the same time. They seemed to come from all directions. I shined my light into the woods and caught multiple lights reflecting back at me. My first thought was flashlights, but as I looked closer, they were eyes. There must have been at least 12 sets of eyes, all standing about my height. They stayed hidden in the shadows, so I couldn't get a good look at what their faces looked like, but I saw they had ghostly white skin. Their voices sounded human, even though they didn't speak any words, but I knew when I saw their eyes that they were something else entirely. I slowly backed away down the trail. I didn't want to run in case it triggered these things to chase me. I did shine my light once again at the mill. I don't know why I did it. I wasn't thinking rationally at that point. But the dilapidated old building lit up entirely with eyes. I didn't stick around to count them, but there must have been at least another 10 of them in there. The voices followed me all the way back to my car. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. They were coming from all directions. Some close, some far away. It was like they were trying to lure me off the trail or get me lost. Now, I'm not religious, but I was praying to all the gods to get me out of there and safely back to my car that night. Miraculously, I managed to follow the trail out. I was pretty shaken up by the time I got back to the car. I went back to the station and locked myself inside for the rest of my shift. I didn't know what to write in the report. I never talked to the person who left the complaint about the teenagers that night. It was just a message on the answering machine at the station. I tried to call the number, but it was disconnected. I did some digging on the phone number, and it didn't belong to anyone in our county. I then pulled the phone records from the station and matched every incoming call from that day and the day before, and it just didn't exist. I couldn't explain any of it. I decided to make a report of a dangerous black bear in the woods, and we put up barricades to keep people out of there. I don't know what those things were, but I knew they weren't anything good, and I had to keep people away from them. My parents both grew up in Ohio, but moved to the East Coast for better job opportunities shortly after they got married. I was born about a year after. Every year we made a trip back to Ohio to visit and stay with my grandparents for a week or two. Personally, I prefer the bigger cities to the part of Ohio my grandparents lived in. It was pretty rural and not too far from the West Virginia border. They had a little ranch house that was decent, but it really got packed when we stayed with them, especially after my 2 siblings were born. The only summer I ever missed going to Ohio was my junior year when I went to Italy for a school trip, and I felt bad because about a month later my grandpa passed away. But the family got to see him and spend time with him beforehand, so that was some consolation. About a week after his death, my parents told us we were all heading back to Ohio for the funeral. It was about a 6-hour drive to their house, and I rode with my younger brother in my car, and my sister rode with our parents. We arrived just after dark, and after eating a dinner my grandma prepared, everyone was full and tired from the drive. The next day there was a little service at a church my grandparents went to, and then the actual burial at the town cemetery, which was about 20 minutes away from my grandparents' house. Afterwards, Grandma was having people over for a reception and lunch. I met a lot of their friends from the area, and because it was very rural, many people seemed different than me. But everyone was nice in general. My siblings and I were pretty beat from the drive down and the service and burial, so we ate and then went outside to try and decompress. Grams and Gramps owned a little over 8 acres that backed up to a decent-sized hill that wasn't quite a mountain. It was covered in oak trees and looked dense this time of year. Grandpa had a deer stand somewhere in there, and we decided to troop out to it and just reminisce a little and get some peace. None of us had been to the deer stand since we were kids, so it took some floundering around in the woods before we found it. It looked like Grandpa hadn't used it in a while, and no one wanted to climb up and test it out. But we settled down on the ground underneath and just chatted, which was nice. We siblings didn't always get along great, but Gramps' passing brought us a little closer together. My brother Michael was talking about wanting to go on the same Italy trip I'd just gotten back from when we heard a sort of hollow thud. We looked around because it was a weird sound, and then it stayed silent for a while, and we went back to chatting. But not soon after there were 4 more thuds in quick succession. To me, it definitely sounded like rocks hitting trees and bouncing off. My sister Carrie stood up right away and said she wanted to go back to the house. I could tell the sound spooked her. We were about a 10-minute walk into the woods. I tried to stay calm as I stood too, but I realized that the woods were actually a little too quiet. Quieter than normal. No birds or squirrels jumping around, which is usually a sign that bigger predators are in the area. Grandpa taught us that when we were little, but I wasn't sure if my siblings remembered it. Trying to stay chill so Carrie didn't get any more freaked out, I started ushering us back the way we'd come and talking loudly about whatever I could think of to distract my sister. Mike was starting to look freaked out too. Then he stopped abruptly and pointed and said, "Bear," but the word came out more like a question. The thing he was pointing at was hunched over in a red-brown color, which didn't look like any bears around here. It was also huge, easily bigger than a cow. And as we stared at it, it straightened up. I realized it was bipedal and looking at us, but where I expected to see a bear's snout and ears, the face was very human-like. Still covered in hair, but there was a human nose, and I could see the shape of an ear. It was about 150 feet away. Carrie took off running immediately, and Mike and I did too. We were completely freaked out and booked it back to the house and inside. Grandma must have seen us from one of the windows because she pulled us aside and asked what was wrong. Carrie was too scared to talk, but I explained what we saw, kind of embarrassed because I knew it sounded crazy. To my surprise, Grandma waved it off. She said Grandpa always talked about seeing those things out in the woods. Apparently there were 2 to 4 of them, but they were usually further back up in the hill area. She said, "I wonder if they know he passed and came down to pay their respects." That sounded absolutely crazy to me, but as I've gotten older, I wonder the same thing. Grandma passed away 2 years later, and after that day, I talked to her a few more times about what we'd seen. She never saw them herself since she didn't go out in the woods much, but she talked about Grandpa coming into contact with them a few times and giving them space. He was eventually convinced they were Bigfoot, but Gramps was so even-keeled that he never worried about it or cared to report it. After Grandma passed, my parents and their siblings ended up selling off the acreage in the house, so I never got to go back and find out if Grandpa was right. But somewhere near the West Virginia border of Ohio, there are big hairy creatures with human features hanging out in the woods. I am an officer with the New Jersey State Park Police, and I cover the Wharton State Forest. I grew up around the Pine Barrens, and everyone knows about the Jersey Devil. I heard all the stories, but to me, it was just an urban legend. The Pine Barrens is considered one of the most haunted areas in the country. It's rich with history and folklore, and littered with abandoned ghost towns, the remnants of once bustling iron, paper, and terracotta industries. While the Jersey Devil may be the most infamous resident, he's hardly alone. This brings in a lot of self-proclaimed ghost hunters. One afternoon, I responded to a call about a car accident near one of the abandoned towns. A car had driven off the embankment and crashed into a tree. It was a group of teens, and thankfully no one was hurt, but they were absolutely terrified. Apparently, they were snooping around the ruins looking for a ghostly woman who reportedly haunted the area. Instead, they saw something even more shocking, and they were convinced it was the Jersey Devil. They showed me some blurry pictures, several of a shadowy figure deep in the woods. It could have been a hiker for all I knew, although it appeared to be somewhat misshapen. They had a few more pictures of something flying in the sky that looked suspiciously like a big vulture. It was clear they believed it, but it's not the first time I've seen this kind of photographic evidence, and as usual, it was hardly convincing. Nonetheless, I listened as we waited for a tow truck. They could tell I wasn't buying it, and as they left, one of them challenged me to go check it out for myself, while the others warned me to stay away. It was getting late, but the ghost town was pretty close, and I decided to have a look. Not for ghosts or the Jersey Devil, but to make sure the kids didn't damage anything. It's not uncommon to find graffiti and trash left at these places. The ghost town was a short hike off an old dirt road. I hadn't visited this particular place before, and I admit it was pretty creepy, especially in the waning sunlight. There was no town left, so to speak, just mounds of dirt and the scattered remains of old brick mills and stone foundations, overrun by foliage and trees. Everything looked okay, and as I was about to leave, I was assaulted by the smell of sulfur. That's when I noticed how quiet it had become, as if the chirping birds and buzzing insects just disappeared. It was unnerving. I looked around and something caught my eye. About 25 yards away, lurking in the forest at the edge of the ruins, was a shadowy silhouette. It was hard to get a clear look through the trees, but it did kind of resemble the figure in those pictures the kids took. It looked like it was wearing a trench coat, or maybe a cape, and there was something strange about the shape of its head, like it was wearing a mask or hat. I called out to whoever it was and started to make my way back to the ruins. The figure didn't say anything, just stood perfectly still. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel it looking at me. What happened next was the most bizarre and terrifying thing that I ever witnessed. I called out to the figure again, and as I got closer, I quickly learned that it wasn't a trench coat it was wearing. They were wings, enrobed around the figure, and they suddenly unfurled into a span of maybe 20 feet. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse of the creature. It had the skeletal head of a goat with horns, its body scaled like a lizard. Then it made the most inhuman, ungodly shriek before shooting up and disappearing over the treetops. I stood there, frozen. Did I just see the Jersey Devil? I got out of there fast and didn't look back. I jumped in my car and sat there a minute, my adrenaline still racing. Now I knew why those kids were so scared. I got my head together and started the drive into town. It was twilight at that point, and I was on a dark, lonely stretch of road. I kept replaying the events in my mind, going back and forth between, was that or wasn't that what I think it was? An unearthly shriek pierced the air and snapped me out of my reverie. The same shriek that thing made before taking flight. Then something heavy landed on the roof with a loud thump, causing me to swerve it. I panicked, thinking the Jersey Devil came back to finish me off. I heard the sound of scratching metal as something was ripped from the roof. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the emergency light bar clattering across the road in pieces behind me. The car shook as something banged on the roof. I couldn't see what it was, and there was no way I was going to stick my head out the window. I don't know how long I drove like that, but it felt like forever. I heard that shriek again, and the car rattled as the creature took off. I could literally feel the weight lifting as I was able to gain better control of the steering wheel. I saw the tips of the creature's wings pass briefly in front of my headlights. Then it was gone. I floored it back to the station, and when I got there, I noticed I was gripping the wheel so tight, my knuckles were white. Another officer came out and gasped, pointing at my car. I got out and looked at the roof, which was shredded, the light bar mounts twisted and torn apart. The officer asked me what happened, and when I said it was the Jersey Devil, he laughed. I almost visited those kids to corroborate our experiences, but I thought it best to leave well enough alone. Even in my report, I stated that I had carelessly skimmed a low-hanging branch. The department wasn't happy, but I was too ashamed to tell them the truth, or at least what I thought was the truth. A few weeks later, another officer came up to me in private and said that he too had an experience with the Jersey Devil. He never said anything about it because he was afraid of being ridiculed. I felt a sense of relief, even validation, knowing that I wasn't the only one. I've thought about going to the authorities with what we saw out there in the woods, but they might think we are insane or making a joke. There's no question about it. This is potentially dangerous. There is a creature out in the woods that endangered my friends and almost killed me. Something has to be done. I am a logger living in Northwest Oregon. I've lived up here my entire life. These woods are my home. My father and my grandfather were loggers with the same company. I remember watching them cut down trees. Rather than go to ball games or do Boy Scouts, I sat in the passenger seat of 18-wheelers lugging logs across the state. When the time came to take over the business from my dad, it was one of the happiest days of my life. My friends celebrated with me, and I even got to hire a few of them. We began to turn a decent profit and became known in the area for being the best logging company in the Pacific Northwest. It was the 4th of July. All my guys were off and celebrating. I was planning on meeting them when we heard from a private landowner. He was the wealthy type, and the kind that liked things done on his timetable. We don't usually give these guys the time of day. But whenever I did a job for him, he paid double our price. And sometimes extra. His wife made us lobster rolls, too. He had an extra Range Rover that he didn't want anymore. It was free to me for doing some light arborist work. All this to say, when he calls, we answer. It looks like all he wanted was a few of us to act as fallers. He had some old trees he wanted us to take down. An easy job. Super straightforward. Just a bit tedious. My buddy Todd and I set to work and ended up cutting well into the night. He was getting a little pissed off, but I reminded him of the payday. So we decided to make camp for the night and pick up first thing in the morning. That way it would be out of our hair and we could keep it moving. I pitched a tent for us while Todd made a fire. Even though we missed the festivities of the day, we drank a few beers around the fire and grilled hot dogs. I've known Todd since we were kids, and he always knew how to make a bummer situation a little more palatable. We spent a few hours telling jokes and drinking until we decided to get some shut-eye. The tent ended up being a bit warm, so I decided to sleep out under the stars. It was a beautiful summer night. The stars are always more visible out here in the woods than in my backyard. Eventually, the sound of the wind and the swaying of the trees sent me to sleep. I woke a few hours later in the pitch dark. The stars weren't out anymore. The wind was no longer blowing in the trees. Everything was very still. It felt like it happened in an instant. Like I blinked and this stillness set in all at once. In the distance, I heard a roar. Loud, blood-curdling, echoing through the forest. All my hairs stood up on end as I reached for a flashlight. When I clicked it on, it was super bright. It beamed directly into the deep woods. The roar happens again. The breeze came back. I crab walk over to the tent and kick it for Todd to wake up. Slowly he unzips the tent. He's white as a sheet. I know just from his face that he's hearing this roar also. We know what bears sound like, and we know how to handle them. Todd liked to call them giant raccoons. This sound was different. In hindsight, we were scared, but also curious. Only a very large creature could make a noise like this, bigger than a bear. I don't know of any animals in the United States that are bigger than bears. The next moment, a tree fell about 100 yards from camp. It was a big old tree, probably something we would have cut the next morning. It slammed into another tree, and that one fell too. Todd looked me dead in the eyes. Slowly he raised his flashlight in the direction of the fallen tree and turned it on. We were right. The creature was huge, much bigger than a bear. It was on all fours like a bear. It had that similar giant head. But this creature had no fur, just bare skin. I could see its muscles shifting under its tough skin. Whatever it was, it pushed over a tree like it was nothing. It roared once again and turned in our direction. It stared into the glare of our flashlight and in our shock came at us at a run. We did the only thing our instinct knew to get us away. We climbed a tree. Neither of us slept that night. It seemed like an age passed before the sun came up. We were up in a tree high enough that it must have lost our smell. Looking down, our tent and camp was torn to shreds. It looked like a whole pack of bears descended on it, rather than this one large one. In the morning, we got down the tree and got whatever of our stuff we could salvage. Moving quickly, as quietly as we can, we jumped into our truck and booked it back to my place. I don't know what it was, but it could have killed us. Anyone who lives in our neck of the woods better be careful out there. No camping. Not until we know more about what's going on.